The light switch made the same soft click it had made 20 years ago when I first stepped into that office. Back then, it was a dusty corner with flickering bulbs, a folding chair, and a whiteboard with someone else's doodles on it. Now, it was a glass-walled corner view with ergonomic furniture and a plaque that said LED Systems Architect for about 12 more seconds. I stood there, hands on the switch, watching the overhead fluorescence blink off for the last time. My office plant drooped like it had heard the news too. The photo of me and the old co-founder still sat on the bookshelf, slightly crooked. I never fixed it. Maybe I knew this day was coming. The hallway outside buzzed with the dull hum of people pretending not to care. When you have been with a company as long as I have, your name becomes a whisper that managers squint at on charts and interns search online. And yet, you can disappear with one smug, rehearsed, soul-sanitized human resources sentence. It is a strange thing leaving a job you practically raised from infancy. When I joined Apex Software Solutions, the codebase was duct-taped together by two guys working from an apartment that smelled of fast food and regret. The server was literally under someone's bed. I wrote the very first line of what would one day become a $500 million software suite on a borrowed laptop while a cat walked across my keyboard. I did not just build the system, I was the system. From the login protocols to the reporting engine to the hand-coded database interface, I designed it all. We eventually replaced the interface with something sleeker, but the core remained mine. I built the thing like it was the child I never had. While other departments threw happy hours and went home early, I stayed behind writing patches and onboarding every new chief technology officer who waltzed in thinking he was the next great visionary. 3 chief executives came and went, but none of them ever questioned my place. I was not flashy. I was not loud. But when the application crashed at 2 in the morning or the security certificates expired on New Year's Eve, they called me. I saw mergers, audits, lawsuits, and marriages conducted through office channels. Human resources tried to block certain words once and accidentally shut down the entire knowledge base. And every time, quietly and calmly, I fixed it. I kept things running while others played dress-up in corner offices. And then Brandon Cole showed up. Brandon was the kind of guy who says, "Let us circle back," like it is a power move, and wears cologne that smells of burned ambition. The private equity firm had installed him to modernize us, which really meant slashing anything that was not shiny and new. I was neither. To him, I was legacy code in human form. He swaggered in with his laminated buzzwords and slide decks full of things like synergizing monetization and cloud-native revolutions. I asked him once what a Kubernetes cluster was just for fun. He said he did not get into the weeds, which is executive speak, for I searched it online and still do not understand it. Still, I smiled, nodded, did my job, and kept the system running. Then came this morning's. Brandon's assistant, Kendall, messaged me at 9:42 in the morning. "Can you step into the executive suite for a quick touch base?" The message read. Like I was about to get a company mug or a heads up about some new security protocol, not the gallows. I knew the second I opened the door. Brandon sat in his leather chair like a cat that had just figured out how to open the refrigerator. Human resources flanked him on both sides. Janet Thorne and Donald Gable, the beige team, sat with their laptops already open and their expressions already pre-baked in concern. Brandon stood up, extending his hand. "I did not take it, Edward," he said, like he was not about to professionally murder me. "We appreciate everything you have done. You have been with us a long time." 20 years, I said flatly, just so he had to feel the weight of it in the room. It landed like wet concrete. He smiled wider, like he mistook acknowledgement for agreement. "Right, 20 incredible years, but we are entering a new phase. It is time for modernization. And unfortunately, that means restructuring some legacy positions to make room for new talent. You understand? You have had a good run," he finished, as if he was patting me on the head. He leaned forward, probably rehearsing this in his sleep. "We will offer you a generous severance. 2 months, full health insurance access, outplacement services." "Understood," I said, and stood up just like that, no protest, no asking who they thought could possibly maintain the codebase. Donald Gable typed silently on his laptop. Janet's eyes narrowed. Brandon tilted his head like a confused dog. I watched it land on them. They expected tears, maybe a desperate plea. What they got was silence, so calm it became unsettling. "Edward," Brandon said slowly, "is there anything you want to ask?" I thought about it for one heartbeat. Then I said, "No," and turned to go. The hallway outside felt colder than it should have. People glanced at me, then quickly away, like eye contact might get them fired too. Cowards, every one of them. I had onboarded half of them, fixed their bugs, and signed their time-off requests. I passed the operations pit where someone was microwaving fish. Of course they were. I made my way to my office, taking the long route on purpose. I wanted them to see, not to gloat, just to witness. I packed my ceramic mug and my red leather binder, walked out and took the stairs. I did not drive home. I drove east, away from the office park, past the identical strip malls, towards a spot I had not visited in years. It was a small cafe tucked behind a public library, a quiet place with chipped saucers, mismatched chairs, and internet access that only worked if you asked nicely. I parked, took a breath, and walked inside. The warmth washed over me, smelling of espresso and cinnamon. The barista, a woman who had worked there since the library opened, blinked in surprise. I had not been here in over a decade. I ordered a molasses cookie and coffee, then sat down at a wobbly table in the far corner. From my bag, I pulled out the red leather binder. The corners were worn, and the spine was cracked from years of storage. Inside was the blueprint of my quiet victory. I opened it. To the very first tab, the original operating agreement dated 2 decades ago. Back then, we were just 4 people sharing a borrowed office and a single broken coffee machine. I wrote every single line of code. The founders knew it. I did not take a salary that first year because they were burning through investor cash just to keep the electricity running. So, instead of cash, we signed an agreement. It was notarized, scanned, and saved in multiple secure locations for redundancy. The agreement stated that the copyright ownership of the source code, libraries, and compiled executables would remain with my independent shell company, Apex Loop Systems LLC, until a formal equity conversion was completed and documented in writing. The stamp on the final page of that document was a faded purple circle from a notary public in Delaware. Signed on a cold Tuesday afternoon when we had nothing but hope and a shared credit card. The co-founders had laughed at the time, saying we were being overly bureaucratic and worrying about details that did not matter. But they had signed it anyway, eager to keep me coding. They had called it a temporary placeholder clause. They promised it would be cleaned up once the company received its first major round of funding, except they never did. We incorporated, grew, built client portfolios, and hired legions of software developers. But the assignment clause was forgotten in the rush of growth. The chief executives who followed Brandon Cole's predecessors probably assumed the intellectual property had been transferred years ago, and Brandon himself would not know a licensing agreement if it was printed on his expensive golf shirts. I flipped to the second tab, which contained a chain of emails from 15 years ago. I had reminded the founders that we needed to finalize the intellectual property assignment. Their reply was always the same. "We will loop in our legal department when we have more bandwidth. Thanks for keeping the servers running." Bandwidth was their favorite word for ignoring a problem. I saved every single one of those emails. The binder was not just paper. It was a timeline of their neglect. I opened my personal laptop, the one I had paid for myself, which they could not confiscate. I opened my email and drafted a message to Jeffrey Hooper, a senior partner at a reputable firm downtown. I attached high-resolution scans of the agreement and the email chains. I explained that I had just been terminated without cause and that my company, Apex Loop Systems LLC, was revoking the implicit license for the software core. Jeff replied within 10 minutes. He did not waste time with legal jargon. He simply wrote that if these documents were authentic, the board was about to have the worst week of their professional lives. He scheduled a meeting for 2 in the afternoon at his office. I closed my laptop and took a bite of the molasses cookie. It was sweet and spiced exactly as I remembered. I sat there in the quiet cafe, listening to the rain tap against the window. For 20 years, my phone had buzzed every hour with system alerts, server failures, and frantic messages from developers who did not understand their own systems. Now the screen was blank. The silence was absolute. I was no longer responsible for their crashes. I was no longer the ghost in their machine. They had wanted fresh blood, and now they would have to see what happened when the old blood stopped pumping. At 10:17 in the morning, the system would begin its first routine authentication handshake. The software suite was designed to verify its core license key every 24 hours against a database hosted on a server owned by Apex Loop Systems LLC. It was a security measure I had put in place years ago to prevent clients from pirating our platform. Since my access was revoked and my company was no longer cooperating, that handshake would fail. The database encryption was robust, based on a cryptographic protocol that required a double handshake. I had designed this protocol specifically to protect our software intellectual property from competitors, but now it served as my own protective shield. I looked out the window as the first droplets of a heavy storm began to splash against the glass. Downtown, the office towers of the financial district were shrouded in a thick gray fog, matching the mood that would soon engulf the Apex boardroom. The platform would not crash immediately. Instead, it would begin locking out administrative functions. First, client billing would stall. Then, the administrative portals would shut down. By noon, the entire database would be inaccessible to anyone without the master key. And the only copy of that key was in my red leather binder. By 10:17 in the morning, the first symptoms of the silent collapse began to show on the company dashboards. The East Coast Healthcare Portal, our largest client integration, timed out mid-login for 6 hospital administrators who were trying to pull quarterly reports. 5 minutes later, an insurance claims processor flagged 3 consecutive internal database errors. The dashboard displayed a message stating that the core encryption module was not responding. By 10:26, a government contractor from Washington left a voicemail with our client success team, demanding to know why their custom analytics panel was completely blank. A massive enterprise software system does not implode with a loud bang. It cracks quietly, cell by cell, until the entire structure crumbles under its own weight. In the operations room, Matthew, the junior developer who had spent the last year working on database migrations, stared at the rolling error logs with wide eyes. He stared at the diagnostic console as the failures began to mount. The errors were cascading like a waterfall of red text across his high-resolution screens. He had a custom mechanical keyboard, and his fingers flew across the keys, attempting to trace the roots of the connection. He could hear the hum of the cooling fans in the server room down the hall, which seemed to grow louder as the panic in the office intensified. The authentication flow was not just stalling, it was locked. The back-end databases were rejecting credentials with a simple permission error. The logs showed that access was denied due to insufficient clearance. This was not a network routing problem, and it was not a firewall configuration issue. The system itself was refusing to recognize the servers. The core modules, which I had written during my first year and wrapped in a custom layer of cryptographic handshakes, were completely sealed off. The security keys had expired, and the system was demanding a new validation code that only my company's server could generate. Because Brandon Cole had deactivated my email and company login, he had also severed the only active connection between the platform and the licensing database. By 11 in the morning, Brandon was standing in the middle of the server room. He did not belong there. He paced between the flashing racks of servers like a desperate manager trying to find a physical switch to flip. He screamed at the team, demanding they reboot the entire system. Julia, the lead DevOps engineer, blinked in disbelief at his ignorance. She explained that a simple reboot would not solve a missing licensing key. Brandon did not care. He ordered them to clear the cache and reset the containers. He was shouting commands that made no technical sense. Matthew pulled up the terminal window and tried to run a traceroute command. The output was a series of asterisks and a single line of text that read Apex Loop Systems LLC, showing an address in Delaware. He tried to override the domain name service records on the local router, hoping to spoof the authentication handshake. But as soon as he entered the override command, the terminal threw a critical error. The warning stated that tamper protection was activated and a secondary license confirmation was required within 5 minutes or full system isolation would execute. Julia grabbed his arm, telling him to stop. She warned him that if he triggered the isolation protocol, they would lose every active database container, and the company would be completely dead in the water before lunch. Matthew turned pale as he pointed to the diagnostics monitor. The active queries were looping in a dead end, and every fallback option was failing. Brandon, red with anger, ordered the engineering team to write an emergency patch to bypass the authentication routine. Julia stepped forward, shaking her head. She explained that the core modules were protected by strong encryption, and any attempt to modify the binaries without the private key would trigger a self-destruct security protocol. This protocol would immediately wipe the local database cache to prevent a suspected intrusion, halting operations entirely. The loss of that data would cost millions and trigger instant lawsuits. By noon, a third of the client database was completely inaccessible. Sales representatives were fielding dozens of angry phone calls from frustrated corporate buyers. The office internal chat channels were melting down with questions about who had modified the core routing and why the security keys had changed. That was when Julia discovered the truth. She traced the active code repositories and noticed that the database schema was not hosted on their local servers. It was being pulled dynamically from a remote server owned by Apex Loop Systems LLC. She recalled seeing that name on the original documentation, but she had never questioned it. She sent an urgent message to the systems channel, asking if anyone had the credentials for the remote shell. The answer was a resounding silence. Brandon stormed back to his executive office, his face red with anger. He demanded a complete map of the active infrastructure. When the engineers displayed the network map on the conference room screen, they saw massive gray zones. Entire branches of the database were offline, marked as unauthorized. The system was treating the company itself as an intruder. From my seat in the quiet cafe, I checked the status of the network using a personal monitoring tool I had built years ago. The dashboard showed thousands of failed requests and hundreds of critical escalations. My lawyer, Jeff, sent a short message confirming that our documents were ready for the afternoon meeting. I took another sip of my coffee. The storm was rising, and Brandon Cole was about to find out that you cannot run a software company when you do not own the software. By 2 in the afternoon, the executive boardroom at Apex Software Solutions was in a state of absolute panic. The air was thick with tension and the smell of stale coffee. Brandon Cole sat at the head of the table, his tie loosened, staring at a printout of the software architecture. Roger, the company general counsel, stood near the projector screen, his face pale and serious. He had spent the last 3 hours auditing the corporate registry and the original incorporation files from 2 decades ago. The board members sat in silence, some pacing near the windows, while others checked the sliding stock tickers on their personal tablets. The value of their firm was evaporating with every passing minute of downtime. Roger did not waste time. He explained to the assembled board members that they had a catastrophic problem. The core codebase of their $500 million software platform was not owned by the company. It was registered to Apex Loop Systems LLC, a shell company owned entirely by Edward Langford. Roger pointed to the original operating agreement from 2006. He held the document up, showing the signatures of the original founders, including George Vance and Walter Croft. The assignment of intellectual property had never been executed. Under United States copyright law, specifically Title 17, Section 106 of the United States Code, Edwards Company held the exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, and display the software architecture. Walter Croft, who had been quiet during the meeting, suddenly spoke up, his voice trembling. He remembered that when they were looking for their first venture capital investment, the lawyers from the fund had asked about the intellectual property transfer. Walter had told them it was being handled, but he had never actually followed up to confirm the completion of the transfer. He admitted this to the board, and several members shook their heads in disbelief at the sheer negligence. To make matters worse, Roger pulled up a series of emails from the past 5 years. He read them aloud to the board. In one email, Edward had written to Brandon, asking to schedule a review to finalize the licensing transfer for the database kernel and core routing module owned by Apex Loop Systems LLC. Brandon's written reply was displayed on the screen. He had written that it was not a priority at that time and that they needed to focus on modernization and velocity, promising to circle back the next quarter. The board members stared at Brandon in disbelief. One representative from the venture capital firm took off his glasses, rubbing his forehead in frustration. He noted that the company had spent millions marketing a product they did not even own. Brandon slammed his hand on the table, arguing that they had been using the software for 20 years, which gave them an implicit right to it. Roger shook his head. He explained that by firing Edward without cause and cutting off his access, they had terminated the implied licensing agreement. Without a valid license, every minute the software ran was a direct infringement of Edward's copyright. He warned them that federal damages for willful copyright infringement could reach millions of dollars, and a court could issue an immediate injunction to shut down their servers permanently. Desperate to cover his mistake, Brandon suggested they simply draft a retroactive assignment form, backdate it, and slide it into the old files. He suggested they could sign Edward's name to it, claiming it was just an administrative oversight. Roger stopped him immediately, his voice cold and sharp. He warned Brandon that forging a signature on a corporate contract is a felony under California Penal Code, Section 470. He explained that any such document would be void ab initio, meaning it would be completely invalid from the very beginning. Roger made it clear that he would not participate in criminal activity to hide Brandon's incompetence. The board members murmured in agreement, horrified by the suggestion of forgery. Suddenly, the speakerphone in the center of the table buzzed to life. The founder, George Vance, was calling from his vineyard in Europe. His voice crackled through the speaker, filled with rage. He had received the emergency alerts from their largest clients. He demanded to know why the system was offline. When Roger explained the situation, George lost his temper. He shouted across the connection, demanding to know why their $500 million platform was registered in Edward's name. Brandon tried to explain that Edward was just a legacy employee who was holding the company hostage. George cut him off, yelling that Edward was the architect who had built the entire foundation of the company. George stated that Brandon had fired the one person they could not afford to lose. He ordered the board to suspend Brandon from all operational authority immediately. George made it clear that they would agree to whatever terms Edward demanded to restore the system. He told them to do whatever was necessary to save the company. Across town, I sat in Jeff's office on the 23rd floor. The office was quiet, overlooking the harbor. Jeff was reviewing the final draft of the licensing proposal. He looked up at me and smiled, noting that the board was in a corner. He asked if I was ready to send the terms. I nodded. For 20 years, I had kept the system running, accepting average salaries while the executives took massive bonuses. Now, the roles were reversed. The meeting was set for 4 in the afternoon in the main conference room of Jeff's law firm. When the Apex legal team arrived, they looked exhausted. Roger, the general counsel, sat across from us, flanked by 2 outside lawyers. Brandon Cole was notably absent, having been suspended from his duties. Jeff did not waste time. He placed our proposal on the table. Jeff sat back in his leather chair, crossing his legs and taking a slow sip of water. He looked at the outside counsel and smiled, a calm and confident expression that showed he knew exactly how much power he held in this negotiation. He did not raise his voice or use aggressive language. He simply stated the facts of the case with a quiet authority that left no room for doubt or argument. The terms were clear and non-negotiable. First, Apex Software Solutions would pay a licensing fee of $90 million upfront to Apex Loop Systems LLC. Second, Edward Langford would receive a 10% royalty on all future client installations that utilize the core architecture. Third, Edward would be appointed as a senior technical advisor with board-level veto power over all future changes to the system architecture. Finally, the company would issue a public retraction of the termination notice, stating that my departure was a mistake and acknowledging my role as the primary architect of the platform. The outside lawyers tried to argue that $90 million was excessive and that the 10% royalty would hurt their operating margins. They offered a settlement of $50 million, then $70 million, hoping to find a compromise. Jeff simply tapped his pen on the table and shook his head. He pulled out a spreadsheet detailing the costs of rebuilding the platform. He explained that hiring 50 senior engineers to rebuild the core architecture from scratch would take at least 3 years, during which all their clients would leave and the company would face bankruptcy. He noted that $90 million was a discount for their survival. He also explained the board-level veto power, making it clear that Edward would have the final sign-off on all code-based changes, system migrations, and key engineering hires. The company would have no way to bypass his technical authority. He read the draft public retraction statement, which would be published on the homepage and sent directly to all corporate clients. It stated that the board apologized to Edward for the administrative error and confirmed that he was the sole creator of the platform architecture. Roger looked at the documents, then looked at me. He asked if there was any room for negotiation. I looked him in the eyes and said no. I explained that I had built the company block by block while they ignored my warnings and treated me as disposable fat. I made it clear that they were paying for 20 years of borrowed time. I remembered the late nights in the dusty office, the cold pizza, and the endless hours writing patches, while others took the credit. I had started 20 years ago as a young developer in a cramped room, and now I stood as the owner of the foundation. Roger sighed and signed the agreement. As he stood up to leave, he walked to the door and looked back at me. He told me that he was sorry it came to this, noting that the board had been blinded by Brandon's promises of cost cuts. I replied that they were looking at quarterly profits, and they had simply forgotten that someone had to write the equations that made those profits possible. The next morning, I walked back into the Apex building. The employees in the hallway stood aside, watching me pass with a mixture of respect and fear. The security guard, who had known me for a decade, gave me a warm smile. Several developers were gathered coffee room, and they stopped talking when they saw me walk past. Julia came out of the DevOps room, holding her mug, and gave me a respectful nod. She told me that they had spent the entire night analyzing my code, realizing they did not understand even a tenth of the database schema. She said it was good to have me back. I smiled and replied that I would host a training session on Friday so we could walk through the routing layers together. I made my way to the executive suite. Brandon Cole was gone, his personal items packed into a cardboard box on the floor. I walked past his office and entered my old corner room. The motivational posters he had hung on the walls were being removed by a cleaning crew. I stood there for a moment, looking at the crooked photo of the founders. I finally reached out and straightened it. I sat in my chair and rested my hand on the desk. The desk was clean, and the wobbly ceramic mug sat in the corner. I reached down and clicked the light switch. The overhead lights buzzed to life, casting a warm glow over the room. I was back, not as a legacy employee to be managed, but as the owner of the foundation. They had tried to erase me, but in the end, they had to write my name into the very fabric of the company.